what are analytics, what is data analysis, just to set some concepts, some ideas together, so that we have a common impression of what is it that we're discussing, and some of the nuances, some of the differences between different types of data analytics. Then we go into the fun stuff. Then we start talking about the FHIR resources for this and the tools that exist for this, and that is where we get more technical but more concrete on things. We have then some space for some time for Q&A, and we would like to invite you to please jump up with your ideas, your current challenges, your needs, what triggered you to join this. If it can help us have a more comprehensive or a more focused discussion on what we're doing and to apply it to your reality, that would be good. Then we have another part of the content, which is about data visualization, how to get data visualization done, and then also more Q&A. I will be presenting this the first part, and my colleague Luke Duncan is going to provide you with the actually nice stuff, with the content of all these tools and techniques that we need to have. Just the usual disclaimers and remarks for our webinars. FHIR is a registered trademark of HL7 International. By using the FHIR trademark and FHIR logo, that doesn't mean that this series of webinars are endorsed by HL7. HL7 stimulates communities to grow, but doesn't endorse, for example, this set of webinars. And we don't mean this to be an official HL7 training. We mean this to be an introduction to several topics that may or may not be available in different parts of the HL7 training framework. So if you want to have trainings, if you want to look into official HL7 trainings or HL7 FHIR trainings, you can always go to the hl7.org website. And finally, this presentation is comprised of freely available material, so there's nothing copyrighted here. Everything that we take from the FHIR website and from the internet. And so we don't have any intellectual property rights, or we don't have any intellectual property rights on that. And so this is free to share. The only thing we ask is, if you share, please give credits or please link back to this set of webinars. So with that, and I presume that everyone can see my screen. Let me know if not. Just a bit of introduction to what we're talking about, data analysis and data analytics. So from a previous webinar that we did some months ago, we were looking at when we looked at the case reporting, one of the architecture approaches for case reporting would be that we have first to source the data, to acquire data from different systems. So we have to identify those data sources. Then we have to actually acquire and extract that data. So we have to tunnel that data through some extraction process into a data pool. After the data is in the data pool, then we can pretty much do whatever with it, which at the time was, so we extract the data for data usage purpose, and data usage could be analytics, ad hoc analytics could be, so then we also mentioned for alerts, for example. So we can, once we have the data in our pool, which is a tricky thing, then we can do the analytics that we want on this. And this part, so this webinar is focusing on the extraction and usage. And we are going to talk next about the reporting, so more classic reporting and more ad hoc data visualizations. And this is just one separation that I propose. And I think the most important is that when we talk about analytics, it becomes important to identify what are the use cases that you want to cover. So different types or typical types of use cases for analytics would be, I want to produce standard reports, or So there's an official government report, and I want to produce that report out of my data. That's fine. That's a very classical example of analytics and reporting. The other part of analytics may be more interesting, more stimulating for data nerds like myself and others, is I want to track the data. I want to check the data for patterns to see if I have some things that raise my interest, or I want to see if this event is happening often in this kind of populations, or even more ad hoc. My use case could be, I don't know exactly what I want to get out of the data. I'm a researcher and I just want to look into this and see whether I can start finding some patterns, or whether I find something wrong with the data or something that deserves my attention, whether technical or clinical, and I just want to explore. So these are different types of use cases. So it's rather interesting. When you look at analytics, then it's not just one big black box of concepts like we do analytics. It's good to try to have the some details on the use case. Do we want to make standard official reports? Do we want to get the data available for us to explore? So a bit into the standard reports. So this is typically when we want to have standard indicators. For example, the HIV TX curve, which actually I don't remember what it means, but it's very easy to check what it means because I just had the link here. Yeah, so number of adults and children currently receiving antiretroviral therapy. So this is one indicator that has been defined. It's a standard indicator, and therefore, in a country, we might want to say, this is the indicator that I want to produce, and I want to produce it in a consistent way according to its definition. So this normally means that I require a fixed and well-managed set of data. So you all remember the discussions of death from COVID or death by COVID. That is nothing more than defining the indicator that you want. So if you want to count the people that had COVID at the time of death versus the people that for which the cause of death can be attributed to COVID infection, those are different things, and that is a definition of your standard report. And if it's not standardized, then you'll have different indicators. It's expectable that different countries will have different indicators, but if you have different regions within a country with different definitions of the indicators, then you have a problem because you don't know where to target. And it really happens a lot, if you ask one developer to produce one report and he makes some assumptions, and if you ask another developer to make the other report next month and they make different assumptions, then you have a data quality issue because the data is not defined. So that's why we look at standard reports. And because of this, some governance around the reports is expected. And governance means there should be someone that determines what is the official definition of the indicator, some criteria, inclusion and exclusion criteria. There should be some process of managing that and respective changes. So if someone finds that there is some lack of clarity in the indicator, there should be an ownership to that. So there should be some governance behind defining the indicator itself, so the report itself. This is standard reports. For exploratory analytics, it's pretty much, and I just had some flashy images there, it's pretty much just, if you have all the data, then you can pretty much start exploring this and see whether the data reveals some patterns. And nowadays we have lots of tools, which Luke will mention some of them to you, some techniques to get there to you. We have very powerful visual tools to get the data. So the trick is, how do we get data onto those tools? And when we talk about exploratory analytics, we may start with a specific data set. So this is the data that we have for doing reports, like the HIV data, and we just want to dig a bit into that to see if there's any patterns within that data set. Or we may start without a specific data set, or even with a specific goal, without a specific goal, and say, I just have this data on my server. What can we do about this? So this is great, not just for not necessarily for the official reports, for the standard reports that I just mentioned, but This is great for discovery, pattern finding, and actually could be a good way to validate the reports that I just mentioned before, to validate the data itself. So if you have a report, let's say national HIV, so number of people that have HIV that have ARV treatments, you can actually look at the data and use some ad hoc reporting on top of that to see, well, is this okay? Do I need to improve this region? Do I need to improve that data extraction because maybe my data is skewed, maybe my data has some issues, or maybe I'm not getting the information that I wanted because data is not even there, or maybe by looking at this data in a specific perspective, I can actually gain some new insight. So that separation between exploratory and or ad hoc and structured standard reports, it's not a strict one, but it's just to set the scene for the things that we are going to mention next. So a very brief summary of like a comparison between these things and how these will link to the next section. If we have standard reports versus data exploration, and the name is doesn't mean anything. It's just the word that I could think at the time. If we have, so when we talk about managing, so in terms of managing the analytics themselves, for example, the indicator definition, in the standard reports, they are usually or commonly very precisely defined, because that's what we expect. We expect the government to provide, or the standards organization or someone to define these are the inclusion criteria, these are the exclusion criteria. Actually, let me just look at one example. So there are different ways of representing this. We'll go there in a second, but we typically have a numerator, denominator, the calculation formula, method of measurement. We can have check for data quality, frequency. We can have the disaggregates. We can have inclusion and exclusion criteria. I don't know if we have anything of that here. Yeah, so inclusion and exclusion criteria. So those are structured, and those are the boundaries. Those are the strict definitions for the standard report. If you have a data exploration, you typically don't start with that, or you don't have to start with that. You may start with that or without that. As long as you have the data, you can just browse the data and explore it to see if you find something. Normally, the standard reports and the indicators the indicators are defined from the first time. So someone defines them, and from that moment on, that is what you look at. So typically you get such a PDF and say, this is what we are going to implement, nothing else, nothing more. We can do more, but this is what you have to stick to. And it is important that they are documented. So in your system, if you say, well, I'm going to define this data, and for example, the count of patients will come from that table, and the patients, whether the patients on ART is calculated by this formula, it's important that when you do standard reports that you start to document those things. So that's typically for the standard reports. For data exploration, you typically don't do all that documentation before. You just explore in real time. You just explore very rapidly the data, and then when you want things to become official, like I found a pattern, or I see there's some value into this, or I would like someone else to take a look into this data. So if you're a data scientist or developer, you would navigate, browse the data, and then as you start realizing, this is the way that I can see, this is the perspective of my data, this is the way that the data can be expressed to show this or that property. At that moment, then you start documenting how you conform the data and how you shape the data. In the standard report, that is done upfront. In the data exploration, you first explore a bit, and then you document how the data will be obtained and conformed. Again, this is just kind of an artificial separation. It's nothing that is a very strict thing. It just introduces interesting concepts for us. So extracting data. So in the aspect of extracting data, here's a bigger difference. So when you get standard reports, you get exactly the data. You know exactly, before starting to develop, you know exactly the data that you need. So if you want to do, for example, the HIV people with ARV treatments, you know the data that you will need to get. If you don't have that If you don't have that information, then you know that already that you don't get the data. Whereas if we are talking about data exploration, you don't have a very strict set of data defined. You might as well get all the data that you can and then explore there. So if I were doing this as a data scientist, what I would like to have is give me all your data and I'll figure out what to do with it, because there is always something potentially useful and interesting behind the data that we have in our data vault. An interesting remark here: mind your privacy requirements. In many countries, many jurisdictions, for example, those covered by the GDPR, we cannot say, I might need this patient data for analytics, so I want to store everything because I might want to do something later with it. That doesn't really work well with the legislation. You can do that if you anonymize your data first, but you just have to be careful of the privacy needs. But if you say, I need this data for a specific purpose, if you want that justification, it cannot be because who knows, some useful data is here. So who knows if I get something important? That's not a good enough justification normally for getting lots of data. So just be aware of your privacy requirements when you get data for exploration. Also an impact, that's not really a different, there's not a big difference between the two approaches. In both cases, you do need a data extraction pipeline. You need an extraction process. For the standard reports, you pretty much expect that extraction process to be managed and monitored. So you need to have some controls to see if the data is properly managed there. So if there's duplicate data, etc. For the data exploration, you also need that, but you don't know exactly what criteria you have. So you also leave that for later. And just one additional remark or difference: when you are doing standard reports, you normally want to save the reports themselves. So you want to save the report of January or the outcome of the report of January. You want to persist the report of February and of March, etc. You want to store that data so that actually, for example, you can see that over time. But at least they will be persisted, and it's normally they are officially issued reports. For data exploration, you can still do retroactive data exploration, but when you do that today, so if I do that today, I can look at months from January to April. I can persist it all the time, but typically I'm doing that on one time, and who knows if I will do exactly the same thing next month. If I want to make sure that next month I will do the same thing, then I make that as a standard report, and then the same philosophy applies for the standard reports. So this is the brief introduction I just wanted to set with the difference between those two approaches and the consequences of this for what, linking also to our previous webinars, what we mean when we do indicator and data definitions. So when we talk about data definitions, they can be technical data definitions or semantic data definitions. So the semantic data definitions is you should capture what is the data, so the meaning or definition of the data, cardinality rules, value sets, and any constraints for which we have logical models. And if you go through our webinars, there is the FHIR implementation guide, for example, where we made a logical model for our food allergy. And this is one way of capturing our data definition. So we know that regardless of the technical definition of a data, which can change if you're moving it to a different database or to a different architecture, it's important to say that the patient gender is there and it has those values. Or the patient name comes in a form first name and last name, if you ever need to get patient names. Or the population is organized in city and not street name, for example. So the address. So if you want to have those definitions, it's important to consolidate them, because normally the people that define those reports, and again, I will pull up this example, you have definitions like this: people that have newly initiated RT during the current pregnancy. Well, okay, this is a very functional description of the data. So it's a verbose description of the data. At some point, you'll need to transform this into a technical definition of the data. So it's always good to try to capture this data, or this data definition, into its components. So for example, newly initiated, what is newly initiated ART? Is it during the last month or the month before, or so whatever? This should be defined. And this is how you get the data. So how you get how I get to the attention to the data definition. So when you define an indicator, a report, you typically talk about defining the data, that what it means, and what also the meaning of the data that feeds into it. So all the elements that contribute to a report, all the inputs of the report should also be defined, so that we can manage the report and the meaning of that report as well. So the indicator definitions should be clear, at least semantically. Ideally, you would also define them technically too. So you would say, this is the precise value set, and this is the precise column in the precise table, or the precise element in a FHIR resource where you get the data from. So that should be done as well. And ideally, the analytics report. So when you produce a report, you should be able to trace it to the definition. So if when you issue a report, you say, this is a report, and this is it. This report has been issued today in May, according to the definition that is valid as of today. Maybe the definition has slightly changed since last time we issued the report. So you should be able to maintain some tracing between the reports and the definition. And all of that is actually things that we are going to discuss as we go into more details. And that is what I would ask Luke to please take over. Luke, over to you.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to stop sharing and I'll share mine?
Thank you.
Let's hope this works. Is that visible to everybody?
Yes.
Okay. Cool. So yeah, now we'll start talking a little bit about data extraction, how you get your data out of FHIR and into something where you can do some of this analysis. First, we'll talk a little bit about how to work with some indicator and aggregate data. These are the measure and the measure report that FHIR defines. We'll also talk a little bit about mobile aggregate data exchange, or MADEX. And then we'll just talk about a few ways. And again, this isn't comprehensive, but it will at least give a couple of ideas of some ways to get your data into what you want to use to look at it. Use this ETL process. So first, your aggregate data can be viewed by using measures and measure reports. Measure is kind of the indicator definition. It defines what you want to look at. You can use clinical quality language, which is CQL, to evaluate your FHIR resources. That's basically where you do your programming that can evaluate your measure so that you know what your values are. And the measure reports can be stored forever, so you can kind of look at a particular time period and sort of pull that back out in the future. So the measure resource defines what that indicator is. The logic is defined in a library resource, which will have that CQL, or a lot of times the CQL is converted to an expression logical model, or ELM. A lot of that is handled kind of behind the scenes, but the ELM kind of processes faster than CQL a lot of times. But the CQL basically is compiled into that, and generally you don't need to worry about it. So the measure resource defines a lot of population groups. So this would be around what you can have your initial population, your numerator, your denominator. You can have various exclusions there, and your CQL would then be defined to say how you would calculate that out of the FHIR resources that are there. It will also include stratifiers. So these are the things you want to break up your data by, either by age range or gender. You can have anything you've got for your data, you can define here. You could have pregnancy status, or in any other status that's related to the person that you want to have. And it can also include what supplemental data you want to be included in that measure report when it's calculated. The evaluate measure operation is defined in the FHIR specification. This is how you can say, hey, I've got a measure for, we could use Jose's example that he was showing to say, hey, I forget what the exact one was, but you could, if you've got one for
HIV people that have ARV treatment.
Right. Yeah. On ARV, you could define, you have that measure, and then you say, I want to know it from this particular date range. So that will go through everything that's in your CQL library, and it will return your measure report for that date range. And this is currently built into the FHIR server, although I don't think it has everything possible for CQL to do at this point, but they are continuing to improve that. But that is something that you could start to play around with if you've got a measure and some CQL. So as I said, that evaluate measure will give you the measure report. So that basically has your calculation. So it would have the number for all of those populations, including all the stratifiers. So if you've got, your numerator and your denominator, so the denominator is going to be your, generally that whole population that fits, and then all your stratifiers. So you can have, gender and age range and things like that. You have all your numbers, and then you can use that to kind of, look at your data, explore your data. You could pull that into other systems to explore, and we'll get into more what you can do with that a little bit later. So if you've got measure and measure report and you want to use it in your architecture, the FHIRs can be pretty broad, and how you want to use it could differ. So that's where Maddox has some patterns that you can use, and if you use those, then it improves your interoperability, because anyone else that's supporting Maddox you can interoperate with pretty easily. So Maddox is an IHE profile from the Quality Reporting and Public Health Committee. It just explains how it's an extension, well, not an extension, but a companion to the aggregate data exchange profile. It's just the FHIR version of aggregate data exchange using measures and measures reports instead of ADX, which is a custom XML format. So there are 4 actors in Maddox. The content data structure creator and consumer are the actors that deal with the measure resources, and again, that's that indicator definition. And then the content creator and consumer are the measure reports, and that's just being able to share your measure reports. Maddox is defined, it can work with MCSD, which is Mobile Care Services Discovery, and sharing value sets, codes, and maps, SVCM. These are 2 other IHE profiles that just talk about sharing various data. So this could be the data that would help support some of your measures, and the SVCM is how the FHIR version of your terminology. So any of all the supporting information, defining what genders there are, what your age range is, what anything that may be in your data. There's 2 transactions in Maddox. The send aggregate report, this is just how you can share those measure reports that you have created. You can send a whole bundle of different measure reports, so you could have, for multiple measures, you can send a bunch of reports for a particular time frame. So this is how you can kind of share it up the chain, either to the, for example, the Ministry of Health, or to other donors. And then the other transaction is how to retrieve aggregate report definition, and this is where you get the measure from the structured data creator. So this is how you share out those indicator definitions. And this sort of just shows how the actors go together. You can have your structure creator. Again, this is the FHIR measure resource. And then if you've got your content creator, this is the one that's going to be creating the measure report. So it needs to get the measure, and then it can calculate the measure report. It may be pulling some data from an MCSD update supplier. It may be pulling in some terminologies, and then it can send that measure report to the content consumer, which again also needs to know what the measure definition is. It would also need to look up any of those care services or any other terminologies that might help to go along with that measure. So this just kind of shows how that may fit in your architecture a little bit if you've got multiple sources of your data and to fit with these IHE actors. So the next step is just other ways to get your data out of FHIR. FHIR resources are complex objects, so there can be arrays and there can be other sub objects that sometimes is a little hard to use in traditional data analysis. A lot of that works with flat data like a CSV or a relational database. So part of what you're going to want to do is have this data extraction pipeline to take your data out of FHIR and have some other way to work with it. FHIR has something being worked on. It's the bulk data export. So that can export a lot of FHIR data at once. It exports it in a new line delimited JSON. Basically, it's just one line for each JSON resource. It's called indie JSON, so that you can then process it. So you could process that with your custom scripts. There's a node module called FHIR to ES, which will pull data into Elasticsearch or OpenSearch to where you can then use those tools to evaluate your data. You could also extract your data into a column-oriented format like Parquet. You could use structure maps. This is just sort of here to show some other examples. I'm not sure that this is necessarily the best way to do it, but that is one option that sort of works within FHIR. Or you could have other custom scripts and tools again, and it would depend on kind of what your end result is and what you want to get out of it. Another option for using Elasticsearch or OpenSearch is to use something like Logstash. Although that does, again, require some custom scripting to kind of flatten your data into, well, not necessarily flatten your data, but to get it into the format that you would want for Elasticsearch or OpenSearch. So the FHIR, there's different ways to get your data out of the FHIR server. Again, you can use this bulk data export, and these links just kind of give a little bit more details. We'll make sure these are in the notes, but you could also come and look at the presentation to get these links. There's also a paper. Again, some of this stuff is still being worked on. There's a proposal. This second one kind of talks about other ways to use the bulk data export. So for example, they're proposing that you could get, instead of getting MD JSON, you could get Parquet files directly out of a FHIR server using the FHIR specification. But again, this is sort of a work in progress. It also talks about, there's another format, AVRO, which is used with Hadoop. So a lot of the big data servers can use formats like that. And again, those are just some ways if you've got a lot of data to be able to evaluate what you've got there. You can also use the history interaction, which is again just a default part of most FHIR servers, and this can just get any changes since a particular time. So in your extraction pipeline, if you just want to make sure you get all your new data out of your FHIR server, you can use the history interaction, and you can also just do searches to find what you want, and then you can have again some custom scripts to flatten this data or combine multiple resources into the ways you want to look and evaluate it. One thing you shouldn't try to do, again, then it's going to depend on what server you've got. But for example, FHIR has a relational database behind it. This can be Postgres or MySQL or anything really. But you don't want to access that data directly. So if you're using Postgres, you don't really want to connect to the Postgres data and try to write scripts to pull your data out, because that structure can change and you could cause problems for your FHIR server if you're accessing that directly. It's generally better to use the FHIR interactions to pull out your data. So this FHIR to ES is a node module. You can define how your FHIR resources need to be combined, how they work together. And they can basically flatten that data. So, if you wanted to combine your patient data with encounters or observations, you can define them in this FHIR resource to show the relationship, and then it will, you can run it and it will continually, pull, or you can run it on a regular basis. It will pull out your data and then save it to Elasticsearch or OpenSearch. And then you can use something like Kibana or OpenSearch dashboards to do visualizations, or you can use other capabilities of Elasticsearch or OpenSearch to work with that data. Elasticsearch, OpenSearch are they basically index your data, so there's there's a lot of opportunities to explore your data using those. Parquet is a format defined by Apache, or the Apache Foundation. It's a column-oriented format, so instead of saving things by rows, it does it by columns, and you can really compress the data quite small. You can load this into a lot of tools. If you work with data scientists, they may work with things like this. Apache Spark is a fast server that can read this format. It can also read CSV. Hive is a way to persist the data. Spark generally keeps things in memory, so it's kind of a temporary thing while you're exploring your data. You can use tools like Splink, which does record linkage, but also does allow you to kind of explore your data. Or Python or R. Again, people that have done some data science may be familiar with some of these tools. And OpenMRS has a FHIR analytics kind of group that's working on some things, and they have some ways to convert FHIR to Parquet. Again, there's a couple of details on what they're doing. There's a GitHub repository for getting that data in, and then just some details on what they're working on there. And a lot of people I know are already using DHIS2. Right now, DHIS2, as far as I could tell, doesn't have Maddox support. Hopefully that will be something that will be added in the future, and then you could just send your measure reports directly into DHIS2, and if you've already got it running, then you can view your indicators there. In the meantime, you could have some scripts that can convert your Maddox into ADX files, or if you just had a custom script that could convert your FHIR resources into ADX to load them into if you have an existing DHIS2. Okay, we'll take a just any questions or thoughts, or if anyone else is doing anything different around data extraction, or if you want to share what you're doing, we can sort of look at that too. And then after this, we'll move into the data analysis and visualization. So I'll open it up. I don't know, I haven't been keeping an eye on the chat, so I don't know if anyone's had any questions or any thoughts. But
nothing
please,
on the chat. Yeah, there's nothing on the chat, but please bring up your ideas or your thoughts. Let me start by one thing that I just realized after you mentioned it. One other reason that I think is not a good idea to mess with your database. So if you have a PostgreSQL or a MySQL or something, is that normally when you have a FHIR server, or when you have your data system, you do have also access control around it. You have a lot of measures to make sure that only the people that are authorized to see the data, they can see the data. Now, if you go to your database directly, then you're kind of defeating that purpose. You're bypassing that, and either you have to redo the same mechanisms in your analytics access, which is feasible, and then you have double work. Or maybe, and most likely, there might be something missing, and then you have just another, privacy accident waiting to happen. So this is just another, maybe another argument to say don't do analytics directly by messing with your database. Any thoughts, any questions, oh, there's a question on the chat. Can it replace the Delta Lake for big data? Luke, I don't know if you can decode that language.
Well, I think you mean data lake.
Oh, yeah, I presume so.
So again, it depends on, I mean, you potentially could use a FHIR server for your data. As I said, a lot of the things like Hadoop or something, if you're using one of the big data, you may want to store it in a different format. That's where you might look at that Parquet or the Avro format. So a lot of the times, again, it depends on what you want to do with your data lake. If you need all the source data there, then I think that does make sense. You might want to have something like, you could have your FHIR server there to store everything in FHIR format. But you would, on top of that, when you're doing your analytics, you would again probably have some kind of ETL or some extraction pipeline to convert that into a particular format depending on what your indicators are. If you're doing FHIR for everything, again, so if you're using measure and measure report, then it perhaps makes more sense that you could just have everything in FHIR. You can have your measures defined. You can build those measure reports and save the measure reports, on whatever timeline you're doing things. You could have quarterly or monthly or even weekly measure reports that you can save. And we've got a question about some of the tools being in development. And if there's a large scale, I mean, a lot of people are using FHIR. I think a lot of the pieces with analytics, again, there's some, a lot of some of that extraction pipeline is still in the works. But I think there are some people that are using it. And if we could look at some of the OpenMRS, let me see if I can, I don't know, it won't let me go back. Oh, there we go. This has some ways that you could use the various pipelines to get your data, to kind of explore it. So something like this would be there, to get your data into, something that could be working. But yes, it is still being developed, as you say. This is still not there, but I think you can use it, and I think the one benefit of using these is that then they could can improve the tools so they can start to work better in the future. So there's another question about FHIR being around health and clinical data. So yeah, FHIR is for it's fast healthcare interoperability resources, so it is all around health and clinical data. I think there are some related areas that's not necessarily clinical. It doesn't necessarily have to be patients. You could look at things around facility and logistics,
supply chain.
But yeah, the main focus is right. The main focus is, I think, a lot of it would be around clinical data, but there are some, like I said, some tangential areas related to that.
And look, just if I may, just on the tools being under development, I think another way to look at this is that there are tools like facilitator tool that are being developed. So this method of extracting data, this approach to do this, they are being developed. And yeah, you can look at the glass half empty or half full. So yeah, I would like those to be fully proven in a production environment. But if that is not there, what am I going to do? I'm going to do something myself, and that what I'm going to develop tomorrow is actually not really well matured in testing yet, as long as I don't start it. So there is a big there's always going to be the decision between, do I wait for those things that are out there to be perfectly mature, which who knows when that happens. So we talk about Elasticsearch. It's everything. Every one of those projects keeps being developed. They are mature enough, but they are not finished. Or do we start from scratch and develop our own thing? So I think another way to see that is, what exists out there works. There might be some issues, but if they are typically open source projects, it's good to contribute to those. And if the alternative is when you start developing your own thing, then by definition, I would say that our own thing is one step behind what other people have been doing. And there's a lot of good practices and knowledge that is built into those tools. So it's always good to at least look at those tools out there. And from there not assess if this is mature, but rather assess, is this mature enough for my purposes in my system? Do I want to use that and take a bit of the hit if that has a critical part that for me matters, or am I good enough with what I have off the shelf? Just bringing that different perspective.
Okay, any more questions or thoughts? Or again, if you want to share what you're doing, that's fine. And you can certainly come off mute as well, if you'd like to ask your question or discuss. I'll give it another minute, but if not, then we can move on to the next section. Okay. We can
let's move on.
Move on. So this part's about data analysis and visualization. So once you have your data in the formats that work for whatever tool you've got for this, this is some ways to look at that. So we'll start with data analysis, show some examples of what Splink is, talk a little bit about Python and R and SQL on FHIR. And then we'll look at some examples for data visualization. And of course, this isn't comprehensive. It's just a few examples of things that are out there with some tools available. But you can certainly, if you've got some tool already for, again, DHIS2 can be used for some of your visualizations as well, if that's especially if it's something you've already got in place. So again, you might, one part of this, and this is where you would have, generally a human kind of looking at things, but you kind of want to analyze your data. Splink is a tool written in Python. It uses Felighi Center to do some probabilistic matching along with some expectation maximization. It works with Apache Spark, and you can use Jupyter notebooks to kind of look at your data. This is just some examples of what you can do with it. So you can see how many matches fall based on, again, there's some, you define your criteria for what would make a match and how many matches there might be in your data. It can get really detailed, and if there are any data scientists, they can probably get into more details than I can on this. I just sort of, use it to kind of review and kind of set up ways that you can define a Felighi Center matching in other tools that might be out there that you would want to use kind of in a live process. This is something you would do kind of offline, someone to just explore your data. But it can analyze your data. It can show, again, this is showing, if you've got a year of birth column, it shows, there's some fields that have 5,000, and then it just sort of shows the breakdown of how many records share the same value, and you can kind of look to see, okay, 1981 has the most, and then 1979. So it kind of gives you an idea about your data. It can also do things like show you, how many, for this one, 117 are null, so that kind of tells you how clean your data is. If you have a lot of null values, it might not be as good of a column to use when you're doing things like comparison, or just to kind of see what data you have. And of course, you can see this on any of the fields that you have. This one in particular, again, you can use this with Parquet or with CSV, and you can, again, have Python code. So, when you're doing things in code to kind of pull this together, you can use kind of, look at those arrays or, complex subfields instead of just sort of flat data. So it is kind of nice that you can look deeper into it without having to necessarily convert your data. Although if you need to kind of combine FHIR resources, then again, you probably would have some process to extract it or kind of flatten it a little bit. Again, when you want to link your patient to various observations. Again, if you have any data scientists that have probably already been using Python or R to kind of analyze your data, you can use that. There are other notebooks that you can find that other people may have developed, and again, you can use Apache Spark to load your data and do various queries. And there's also, again, this is another thing that is under development, but there's a proposal to be able to support SQL on FHIR. This is, again, a standard way to do queries, sort of like if you've used traditional databases, it just sort of works like that. But again, you can get into these subfields that might be more complex values to query your data and kind of look at it. And then again, you could pull this into some more standard visualization tools once you have these queries built. Again, this is a work in progress, but I believe there should be some opportunity to be able to utilize what's there. So another tool, you can use OpenSearch dashboards. OpenSearch There's a complex history about, it was forked off of a version of Elasticsearch that was an open source. Elasticsearch changed their licensing. It's still free, but they changed the licensing to not be an open source license after a certain version. So OpenSearch built off of that. So it has, it's not as mature for some of the tooling. So building visualizations is a little more complicated. Once you get the hang of it, a lot of the standard things you might want to do for building some dashboards is already there, and it can do user access. It allows in this, since it's OpenSearch in the free version, you can have ODBC access, which allows you to connect other tools to your data in a standard way. It also allows you to do more access control, so you can get finer control over what you want people to see and kind of limit to certain areas. But it's nice, you can build maps, you can build standard charts, and if you want to get more complicated, there's this Vegas or Vega Lite that you can use to kind of build some of your reports. I won't get into the details, that gets to be pretty deep, but if it is something that people are interested in, we could look at some of these for perhaps a future webinar or fireside chat or something, or even, I guess it's not even necessarily FHIR related, but if there's some interest in looking at how you could utilize some of these tools, let us know and we can see if that's something we could set up in the future. And also OpenSearch is still in development, or not still in development. There are releases, but they're still adding a lot of new features. So I think some of the things they're working around are easier ways to build some of these charts. So some more of the kind of drag and drop and sort of choose what you want to see in a simpler way, and even allowing more custom formatting. I think there's potentially some work around using handlebars, which is again, kind of a simple way to define, kind of format your data, and give you a lot of control over what that looks like. Elasticsearch Kibana, again, they once they sort of split their license, they have a tool called Kibana Lens, which is again a simpler way to kind of use drag and drop to define your visualizations and kind of put them together. And you can do some dashboarding there. You can also do, the older way that OpenSearch does is still available in Kibana as well. Again, you can do maps and you can use that Vega for more custom versions. The downside here is without the licensing, you can't use ODBC and some of the finer, you can use some basic access controls, but the finer controls, to kind of record level access controls isn't available in the free version. But you do get some nice, if that's not as much of a concern, it is a little bit easier to use Kibana Lens to create some of these visualizations. And again, if that's something people are interested in, we could, look into kind of having a future session to kind of look at how you could use these tools and get a little bit more in depth on how you would do some of these. And also that fits into using something like Splink as well. We could, pull up the Jupyter notebook and kind of play around with some sample data and see what kind of things you can do with it. Apache Superset is another kind of dashboarding visualization tool. Again, it has a lot of nice features built in for access control and kind of building your dashboards. It's a little bit easier to kind of define. It generally works, again, it's mostly on that kind of flat data, but you can link into things like Apache Spark or Apache Hive. I mean, these are all of the databases that it works with. Once you've got your data saved, so you can load in again those Parquet files or CSV files or have them in a database, and then you can build your charts off of that, and then you can share them with others. And so again, here's some examples of various ways that you could do some charts. There's a lot of libraries, there's a lot of visualizations that are there that you can choose from. If you have some developers, you can build plugins. If there's a visualization that's not available, you can do a plugin for it. It does have map support, so there's lots of ways that you can build your maps as well. And people are working on these plugins. You could find other people's plugins as well to utilize. And again, they also have, I believe, again, it's a new feature or an upcoming feature where people have requested to do something like, again, using handlebars, which is basically a templating structure to be able to just, you have full control. It's more like if you really have a particular way you want to see your data, things like that will allow you to have that finer control that a lot of people want to see. Again, once you've got it in this Parquet or CSV, you could use something like Tableau and Power BI. It can connect to a SQL server, or with this ODBC, it could connect to OpenSearch or Elasticsearch if you have a paid version. But these are not cheap software, but they do have a lot of features, and you can do a lot of analysis and visualizations. And with the server versions, you can share them out to people, and so you can build dashboards for people to look at. And if you have, again, kind of that data analyst or data scientist, they can do a lot with these tools. But again, it's not a cheap way to do it. And of course, you can build custom solutions. A lot of times, people will they want to see things a certain way, and some of these tools don't necessarily give you that full control, at least at this point. We don't really recommend doing this, but sometimes that's the way people want to go. And there are certainly a lot of libraries out there. There's a lot of JavaScript libraries that you can use to build visualizations, but so you can have any visualization, any layout. You can get really detailed with maps and layers. And that's a whole nother thing. If you've got some kind of mapping software, there's lots of ways to pull, once you have your data in this CSV or even measures and measure reports, you could build layers on maps if you want to, get really deep into kind of map-based charts. A lot of the tools that are out there will do some simple and what most people want to do, but if you really want to get a lot of details on your maps, you might want to build it in, and you kind of have to do some custom things there. But the downside of this is you have to maintain all those libraries, and if you have to build your own access control, you can't just use what's already out there. If you want to add a new chart, that's going to require a developer generally, not someone just kind of using the interface. And again, you've got to add all those other security access controls if you want to export different formats and things like that. You have to write all that, and you have to maintain it as if libraries get stop being used or they're out of date, then you have to keep that up to date. Whereas if you use some of these existing tools, then that's kind of managed for you by the community around those tools. So you gain a lot by having a large tool with a lot of community support already. So again, if there's any questions around some of the visualizations, or again, what if people want to share what you're doing, that's great as well. I see there was some chats. That was just about
recording,
webinars.
yeah.
Okay.
It would be interesting if people just come off mute and share what they are doing or what they are interested in doing for analytics. If someone wants to mention any ongoing projects.
Hi, my name is Kshitij. I'm currently part of WHO's GIS Center for Health. I'm currently working on several projects that require consultation on the collection of data. Mostly like it's for WHO, so it's like health data. I'm not sure if I'm audible.
Yes, you're very faint, but I can hear you.
Okay. I'm not sure like my system. So yeah, we are planning to use the analytics for. We were primarily doing Power BI dashboards, but now we are moving into creating dashboards that are interactive. So that's when I joined in. I primarily work with Node.js, so I will definitely explore the library on Node.js for this.
Okay. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, the library I was sharing for Node was mainly to take FHIR resources and load them into OpenSearch or Elasticsearch, and then you can use the Elasticsearch or Kibana or OpenSearch dashboards to build your dashboards, to build those visualizations once it's loaded into Elasticsearch.
So
And I think some
similar.
of the OpenMRS was doing, I think, using Logstash to do something similar. Um,
This is one thing. So similar to Elasticsearch, there is another that I've been exploring for the GIS related stuff is type sense. I think that's what how it is called.
TypeSense.
They have taken, yeah. Um, this is a search board development tool. I'm not sure if it's very familiar, like very popular, but it's called TypeSense. You can
Okay.
It's built on top of it's a open source, but with the TypeSense cloud, they also provide the cloud clusters to prepare your own kind of a search engine that for your data, like you can prepare your own search stack. So I'm currently exploring that option for, but yeah, I'm not sure
Okay.
if that
Yeah, I'll take a look at
works.
that. It looks like they've also got something that's similar to Elasticsearch or built off of Elasticsearch. Yeah, I can take a look. It looks like there's something called Algolia for kind of the back end. Again, a lot, Elasticsearch was kind of built on indexing and searching, but there's it's expanded quite a bit as to what you can do with it. So yeah, that's interesting. Thanks for sharing that. So we'll make sure that's in the notes as well, as an alternative for people to explore.
And it would be interesting as you explore that, if you want to feed back to the community and share what your experience turns out to be. And if you say, well, I had this implementation, or if you produce something, it would be really nice to that. So we are creating a community, or we are fostering a community of people that are implementing or have implemented. So that would be interesting to see as you experiment, what are your conclusions, your recommendations, etc. Looking forward to that.
Yeah, on that note, like, do we have a community, for example, like any Slack or common community space channel, or it's just currently on GitHub?
That's
Is
the
there any
next.
place where we can?
That's the next.
Okay.
So we have. So we are trying to feed onto the broader FHIR community, because that's where. So we have lots of interest there. Look, if you just want to skip the next slide, please. Yeah. So chat.fire.org or community.fire.org. Chat is live chat. Community is more of a post your question and come back tomorrow to see if you have any answers. But and I don't mean to wrap up the discussion on this. I just want to say that if you have these things, there's certainly something on the chat.fire.org that you can look up, or you can, if you want to get in contact with anyone, with Luke or myself or anyone, just look it up on chat.fire.org. So yeah, so that would be a community. So through the channels of Digital Square, but maybe better through the chat.fire.org. Yeah, just reach out and say, well, I'm working with this and I had some experiences. Especially if you tag one of us, then we'll provide what insight, or we'll learn as we'll be triggered by that. There's another question from Carlos Tejo for a very quick proof of concept. Which tools do you recommend for extracting information from a FHIR server and visualize it? Luke, this is you, right?
Sure. Again, I think it kind of depends on what you kind of want to do with it. Sorry, I'm just trying to to think. I mean, honestly, you know, if you, yeah, to do some quick things, yeah, it kind of depends on your visualizations and your limitations. You know, I suppose if I needed to do something quickly, I would probably use, again, like that FHIR to ES, and I would probably load it into OpenSearch, or again, if I wanted, you know, to kind of use the Kibana lens, maybe I'd use Elasticsearch and just build some quick tools there. So you just kind of have to define, you have to kind of define that relationship of how your FHIR data relates and save that. So that's probably what I would do, just because I'm more familiar with it. You could certainly, you know, perhaps if you're more familiar with some scripting language, you could just pull the data out again, you know, using you know, again, using REST, you could use that history or the bulk data if that's supported in the server that you have, to just pull your data out, convert it into some flat format and load it into a database. And then, you know, again, then I would, you know, if I had it into a flat CSV or a database, then I would probably use something like Superset to build some quick visualizations. If you have Power BI or Tableau, then that, you know, would be a very similar way to do it if you're just kind of doing some proof of concept. But I would probably, yeah, I think if I were trying to build something quickly, I would probably, you know, for a proof of concept, I'd probably go with Superset. And yeah, you'd have to convert it to flat somehow, and you could use some version of the FHIR to ES, you know, if you wanted to. It could also, you know, the Parquet is interesting, but you know, you still would probably have to do a little bit of work to access the Parquet, again, because of the arrays or the complex subfields that FHIR has. So you kind of want to define how you want to get it out. You know, if I were doing just like you said, a proof of concept, I would potentially probably just write some script to pull out my FHIR data and flatten it. You know, that's probably the quickest and simplest. I'm not sure that I'd want to do that for long term, but if I were just trying to do something quickly, that's probably the quickest way for what I would do. So it kind of depends on what you have available to you. But I think, yeah, kind of flattening it. You know, ideally in the future, if there's, you know, the opportunity to do the SQL on FHIR, that would, you know, again, be a nice way to do it. But yeah, that's not quite ready for prime time. So I would probably just, yeah, like I said, convert it to flat and then use whatever tool you want to for doing the visualizations that you're familiar with.
There's another question. Can it be used with a field data collection tool like ODK Central? If that is about collecting data, for example, I did not know the tool, so I checked it. It seems to be like an Android platform thing to collect form data. Although the question is answered, you might want to look also at our previous webinars where we did discuss there is also a FHIR way to collect data in a structured way. So there's a FHIR questionnaire that you can actually extract the data into FHIR resources, and you get quite flexible in collecting the data, like making a form in a specific format and say this is going to collect the HIV data, for example, and that is allowed in FHIR, and then it flows with standard FHIR tools. It flows into the FHIR server, and from then you can do the analytics. So you might not need to flatten it. You might really put this in the FHIR server, because yeah, if you have a flat data set, then you don't have a FHIR data set. So it's either before in the FHIR pool, then you have FHIR data. After that, if you flatten it, then you're just doing analytics. So if you want to collect the data, and I'm just trying to visualize the pipeline. It's one of the first slides that I was presenting before. If you want to do analytics on the clinical data that you have plus form data, how do you put the form data in there? Well, you can flatten the form data and put that at the end just in the visualization layer. You could, but maybe you want to have that data, that field data collected into the FHIR pool, and then do the analytics, because then all the data becomes integrated, and you know the patient that is not having treatment according to the form, but we know that he has been to the clinic, so we know that he has been taking the treatment, so we can check that data in consistency if we just have a bigger pool of data. Otherwise, if we have small pools of data, we lose in consistency. So just to ping that, to answer that, and in any case, this is all in the FHIR webinars that we had. I'll check which one, but I think it was the one in March. No, it was not in March. It was the case reporting. I don't find it. I'll try to find a link for that. It's the case reporting webinar that we had. Yeah, so it's on January 12th. You might want to check that for an option to bring farm data into FHIR.
So there's another question in the chat about a system with 1 million patients. What's a way to export from the FHIR server? You know, I think the best way in that case would be something like the FHIR bulk data export. And again, I don't know how widespread that is at this point as to how far the support is. So you just have to see if your server supports that. The other option, you know, again, it's something you'd have to, you know, it would potentially be really heavy the first time, but once you could use something like the history transaction, which will get updates since a certain time. So then, you know, once it's done, you know, once you've got your 1 million patients, it depends on how many you're adding every day. But yeah, it can be a bit, you know, and I'm not sure how easy it would work at something like that on scale. That, like I said, the history is nice because then you can just get the changes for the day. But if you have a large amount of changes going on all the time, it can certainly get intensive. And in that case, maybe that's where you'd want to have, you know, some replication set up so that you could have, you know, basically a copy of the FHIR server that you can use for this analytics, or for extracting the data for analytics. But certainly at scale, you start to get different issues around that as to, you know, what your architecture is. But yeah, I think it might make sense to have basically a backup server that you would use for your analytics and for your extracting that data, where you don't have to worry about affecting the data, you know, the day-to-day usage of your FHIR server. You know, and there's various options out there. It kind of depends on how that server's set up, where you could do the replication, so that you basically have a copy where you don't have to impact your primary server. Yeah, unfortunately, the API doesn't make it quite as nice, but there's not a good way around it that's safe, or that can guarantee. But I think the bulk data export would probably be the way to go. But yeah, we just have to sort of see where that's at. And I don't know about the full support. I haven't seen. I know that FHIR is working on some support for it, but I'm not sure how far along they are. You know, again, this is something that's still being, you know, defined. Jose, do you know how far along some of the bulk data export support is?
Oh, sadly, I'm sorry, I don't.
No, that's fine. There is also, again, on the Zulip chat, there is a stream on bulk data. So that's a good place to join. Let me see if I can copy the link. I don't know. Unfortunately, sometimes my virtual machine doesn't work. Yeah, this looks like it'll work. So that's a place where you can kind of see what's going on around that area. Looks like it is going to be a topic in the Connect-a-thon that's coming up. Is that next week, Jose? Do you know off the top of your head? It's this month, but I'm not sure which week.
I'll check.
Yeah, the FHIR Connectathon.
No, the Connectathon is now. Sorry, I thought you meant.
Oh, this week. Oh, okay.
Yeah, it's now. It's actually ends today.
Oh, okay.
I think.
So yeah, so it is a topic that's going on during the FHIR Connectathon this week. But that Zulip stream is where a lot of the conversations are happening.
A question related to that really big data scenario. I unfortunately have to admit that I only saw the last 2 minutes of your presentation. So if that is covered somewhere, just tell me to look at the recording afterwards. We from OpenIMIS, we work on insurance data, and we are using DHIS2 as a platform to provide a dashboard on those data. And yes, exactly. So right now we are using the tracker level to export detailed level data like claims, and they really get a lot. I mean, there are several tens, hundreds of millions of records that you normally have to push into those systems. Well, of course, we're having those discussions. Maybe we can do the aggregation already on the OpenIMIS side, and then just use ADX to push it to DHIS2. But from my personal history in a bank that I used to work before, we did data warehousing with differential loads. So basically, you would build up in your data warehouse different levels of granularity, and then from the source system you would not do a full load of all the data every day. You would just push the data and the records that have changed. For example, if a patient has a corrected birth date or something like this, you would just push the changed record and propagate all the changes into the aggregates up there. And for that you need to provide some mechanism to allow that delta mechanism, like having the target system understand that the record that is being delivered is an update and not a newly delivered record. Is there anything like that, like delta mechanisms, differential loads or something foreseen in the standard?
I am not aware. Built in,
right,
I'm not aware. Do you know?
No, not that I know of either. I mean, some of it you could potentially try to calculate. But yeah, a lot of the, for example, that history transaction, it would give you the full, it would only give you ones that have changed, but it would give you the full data for whatever resource changed. So you wouldn't necessarily know, the address changed versus a phone number change. You just see the change. You could theoretically, again, it starts to get more intensive, but you could do, a delta versus previous versions. There are some ways, FHIR does have a patch support where you can define, you could do a patch on a resource to say, hey, here's the one thing that changed, but how you propagate that up into your data, your aggregate data is a little more complicated. Some of these, it starts to get, that's certainly a very difficult situation to try to figure out when you have, again, that's where you're kind of looking at some of these big data servers, and you just have to have that pipeline to get the data in there to evaluate it. But yeah, FHIR doesn't necessarily have anything offhand for that kind of stuff. I'm not even sure. With some of these, I don't even know how you could you couldn't necessarily recalculate previous data for aggregate data. I mean, once but based on a change, if something substantial changed, I'm not even sure how that would be, because you're not necessarily you don't know which record or where it was aggregate, or again, I guess you have to kind of calculate everything based on that delta, to say, hey, because this was the old one, this is the new one, and now we need to update every aggregate based on that if you're storing aggregate data. but yeah, I think that's, yeah, right now I don't know of any tools that are going to do that for this type of system. You'd have to kind of, it seems like you'd have to build that on your own. But I wonder, that could be an interesting, topic for that bulk data. Or there's also a data extraction, there's also a data extraction stream. So any of those could be interesting. Oh, although I see it looks like Jose created that, and there hasn't necessarily been a lot of.
Have you considered? Have you considered layout architectures in data warehouses, like different aggregate levels, or are you just focusing on the ETL and API parts of getting the data to the data warehouse, and then from there on, that's another story.
I mean, yeah, right. I mean, for at this point, we're just trying to get this kind of high level, just ways to get your FHIR data into various formats and how you want to do some of the simpler visualizations. Yeah, we haven't gotten too deep into these more complex, data warehousing type issues.
But if you have a reference or preferred architecture, or if we can get some ideas on that, and if you find value in sharing that, and say creating an inventory of typical architectural patterns or options, I think there could be a lot of value in that.
Yeah, I'd be happy to share more, and I did prepare some slides like 6 years back or something when I worked in Kenya on like getting health insurance data from the source systems into a DHIS2 instance. But I just did full, semi full uploads every night, like aggregating the whole stuff on the source server, and then pushing the aggregated records into DHIS2. What I did do as a somehow makeshift or very simple data mechanism was like downloading all the aggregates from DHIS2 and then finding out the changed records in the ETL tool, and I just pushed the aggregated or the changed records from the aggregate into the DHIS2 instance, which really helped to speed up processes a lot. But that would be very rudimentary. I don't know. I mean, if you're interested, we could get in touch, and we have to rethink the whole thing for OpenIMIS anyway. And
I think that would be really interesting. So we had some recent discussions about how do we get data from systems that are out there. If there's a probability that this data is already in our system, so how can we avoid clogging the system with redundant or duplicate data, whether because we don't know whether the ETL ran okay yesterday, or because the data is just duplicate and scattered throughout different systems and we were not aware of that. So there is interest in that. And we have to, you just mentioned an interesting point, which is a performance. So we can check everything before we import it, but if we check one by one before importing it, then the ETL, instead of taking a few minutes or a few hours, it will take a few weeks, which is not viable. So I think
that wasn't the case, actually. Interesting.
Okay.
I downloaded the full aggregate, and I mean, again, we were talking about several million of records from that system in Kenya. And I downloaded everything from DHIS2. I built the aggregate from the source system. Then I compared the two on a record level, and just
good.
And
so
that was locally. That was
so you have it locally. Yeah. What I was thinking from the other discussions is that maybe we do that remotely. But indeed, if you have it locally, then the checking might be faster. And indeed, this kind of ideas and solutions, I think it would be good to have some discussion. So from the last webinar a few months ago, someone asked me to create a data extraction stream, and I did, but there's no content there. So Uwe, if you have a chat.fhir.org account, I would challenge you to just put your, I don't know, just say hi there or something so that we can follow up. If you don't have a chat.fire.org account, please create one, because if you have a good experience with this, then we would like to learn from it.
Yeah. Okay. Let me see how I get in. I mean, I got your names now, and I mean, it's not the first session where I'm seeing you, so let me try to get in touch. I'm posting a link to a presentation that I had once on a DHIS2 symposium, so you can already see whether that's relevant. Just give me a second. Sorry. There we are. It's an old PowerPoint from a few
Thank
years
you.
back.
Yep. Very good. And indeed, it would be nice to follow up on the chat.fi.org so that we can bring others or share experience with others. And I'm interested myself in learning. So thank you for this input.
Yeah, thank you for the interest.
Any other topics, ideas, any other initiatives that are ongoing? Anyone looking at doing this? Any feedback from what we are discussing today and what you will be trying tomorrow? Anyone have more feedback?
Or again, if there's interest in getting kind of a deeper dive on some of these tools,
Oh, yeah.
I know it's kind of a broad overview, so it doesn't really get you into using them. But if people are interested in something, we'd have to kind of figure out what tool. I mean, if I know there was a Splink webinar not too long ago that was put on by the people who do it, which would probably be better than something I could do. But yeah, I'd be happy to show what I've done with Splink or with OpenSearch or Elasticsearch or Superset, any of those tools. But I'm not sure what interest there would be. And again, I'm not, I wouldn't say I'm an expert on any of those, but I could certainly show, the what I've done. We could certainly do some kind of interactive, exploration of some of those tools and how you can utilize it. And we could also take that offline if you want to. I believe there was a note. I can't remember where everything was. I'm not sure what the best way for people to follow up, but Maria, do you know what the best way for people to follow up or kind of talk about what might be of interest?
Yeah, a direct email to me is completely fine. I tend to coordinate closely with Brunda on all of these planning topics. So let me put my email in the chat here now. And we also have a Digital Square email address that I monitor the inbox for. So both of those are good avenues. And that's on our website, the email for Digital Square.
Cool, thanks. Yeah, and we're a much smaller group right now, so if anyone wants to throw anything they're interested in, feel free. I mean, it sounds like, yeah, again, I'm not an expert on what you were talking about, Uwe, but it's certainly, I'm interested in that, but we maybe need to find someone that could talk more about some of that, the scale of your kind of data warehousing, your data lake, or how to manage that type of issue.
Yeah, as I said, I mean, we have to rework this sooner or later in like our current OpenIMIS setup, and then we'll have a greater discussion on this again, I guess, within maybe half a year or 3 or 4 months, and be happy to have you on board discussing with us.
Yeah, sounds great.
Great. So I don't know if we don't have any other interesting questions or challenges. I don't know if we should wrap up for today. If no one has anything else to add, Luke, if you just allow me to just have stepped in and say, okay, let's then we wrap up. Thank you very much for joining the webinar, and we will see you around in the next webinar or in chat.fhir.org or in any other way that you want to reach out. It's great to have this community of interested people and people with projects that we can learn from. So until the next time, thank you very much and see you soon.